Welcome to Session 7 of the Conservative Intellectual Tradition in America, which is sponsored by ISI here at the Citadel, and we are just thrilled to have today's speaker. He's going to be talking about the culmination of the conservative movement in Ronald Reagan and the Reagan administration, and the role of ideas in the successful political campaigns of Ronald Reagan and in the shaping of administration policy, and the extent to which Reagan appealed to and made use of principles of traditional conservatism, neoconservatism, and libertarianism. We're thrilled to have him, and next week we're going to be talking about what really happened to set the stage for Ronald Reagan with fusionism and Buckley. And our speaker will be David Keene. But right now, I'd like to introduce the former domestic policy advisor to President Ronald Reagan and the former president of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, who was also formerly served as assistant to the Attorney General, as well as the assistant to the chief counselor of President Reagan, T. Kenneth Cribb, Jr. Ken Cribb.
Thank you, Mallory. Thank you, Mallory. We've already discussed earlier today that this is really a groundbreaking course. I congratulate the Citadel and Mallory Factor and his allies that have pulled it off, and to the cadets who have chosen to participate in this exciting inaugural course on Conservatism 101. It's actually fairly appropriate that conservatism receive a course at a major university for the first time, in the sense that it did actually take national power and defeat communism just as a throwaway. So yes, it's time that it had a formal study. Our speaker today, Edwin Meese III, he was Ronald Reagan's top assistant both when Reagan was governor of California and when he was president of the United States. He was U.S. Attorney General following that, and now holds the Reagan Chair at the Heritage Foundation, perhaps the most influential think tank in the world. Now that's a pretty impressive resume. Now I'll tell you why it understates his achievement. So it's appropriate that Ed Meese is here talking with you on a consideration of conservatism. If there is an indispensable man in the conservative intellectual revival, in the conservative movement, it's Ed Meese. He's the glue that holds us together, just as he held the Reagan revolutionaries together in the 80s. He has earned the stature to ask us all to put aside institutional differences, to work for the greater good of the cause of freedom. Oliver Wendell Holmes once wrote that a great man represents a great ganglion in the nerves of society, or to bury the figure, a strategic point in the campaign of history. And part of his greatness consists in being there. Ed Meese was there when Ronald Reagan needed an alter ego to make sure that his aggressive policies did not fall victim to politics as usual in California and Washington. Ed Meese was there to lead what has been called the Great Debate on the original understanding of the Constitution, restoring the Constitution once again to its central place as America's fundamental law, binding as written. Ed Meese was there to serve as President Reagan's chief policy advisor in masterminding the economic recovery in 1981, producing the largest peacetime economic expansion in history to that date. Ed Meese was there to argue for President Reagan's move from the failed policy of containing communism to the military buildup and strategic maneuvers that forced the Soviet Union to spend itself into bankruptcy. Ed Meese has always walked in lockstep with Ronald Reagan in pursuit of one goal: human freedom. Not freedom in the vulgar sense of license, or even merely the freedom to acquire that is sometimes mistaken for the American dream, but freedom in an older sense of the word. Freedom to choose the good, freedom to make one's own way in life, to choose for oneself how to behave honorably toward country and lovingly toward family and friends. It is for that freedom to choose that Ed has toiled so mightily and so well, and with so little thought for himself. The world is a more hospitable place to that freedom because at a critical juncture in human affairs, Ed Meese was there. The cadets, the 75th Attorney General of the United States.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you, particularly to be here at the Citadel. I've been here a couple of times before, but I have never had the privilege of addressing a class, and so it's good to be with all of you and to have this opportunity to join you here, particularly in this particular class and this particular series, which has a great meaning to me, as it does to Ken, as you might imagine, having had considerable opportunity to work in the conservative movement and with conservatives to have a chance to participate in what seems, from what I've read about it, including your syllabus, really excellent course here on the whole conservative movement and conservative thought. As you know, and as it's been indicated, this session is entitled the Reagan Revolution. And I think it's interesting to note, particularly in the military setting here, that this was not a revolution that was achieved by force of arms or by military accomplishment, but rather a revolution that was accomplished by ideas. And it was indeed a revolution of ideas. And it results really from four different factors coming together. Those four factors are, first of all, a movement, secondly, a message, thirdly, a leader, and fourth, a crisis. And it was the confluence of those things together that enabled us to have in this country what we now call, in retrospect, the Reagan Revolution. The modern conservative movement in America is really something that is a phenomenon of the last 60 years, essentially since World War II. Al Regnery, who was here, I believe, for your first lecture, talked to you about this. And he and those of us who have kind of thought a lot about this and the history of the conservative movement since the end of the war, we look at it in terms of three phases. And the first phase, which started immediately after the war, was the intellectual movement, conservatism as an intellectual movement. And it was at that time that many of the scholars on campuses here, as well as in England and some other places, but particularly in America, people like Milton Friedman, Russell Kirk, and people such as that, became concerned about the drift towards socialism in the United States, and even more so the drift towards socialism around the world. And their thinking was, here we have managed to take ourselves out of the threat of the Axis powers, Nazism and the Italian and Japanese threats, and now we have a new threat, which is an intellectual threat to our people, as well as potentially even a military threat, although the intellectual threat was much more prominent at that time because we were actually still allies with the Soviet Union at the time. And so the writings that came out that were fundamental to the movement beginning were people like Milton and Russell, and then the writings of people like Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig van Mises, and others. And at that time there was only one real publication in the United States that was a regular conservative publication. That was Human Events, that had started in the late 40s and which is still going today. And then there was a very important episode in the conservative movement and the entry of a new leader, and that was Bill Buckley. I'm happy to hear that you're going to have a session on him, and I'll try not to steal the thunder from whoever's going to speak on that. But Bill Buckley was a very important part of it, because unlike the others who were older scholars, he introduced a new vigor and a new enthusiasm as a younger man. He had just graduated from Yale. He was at Yale as a rather later than most people, because he had been in the Army before he went to Yale. But at Yale, he was the leader of almost everything. He was the chairman of the Yale Daily News, which was the most prominent position on campus. He'd been active in the political union. He was the chairman of the debating association. He was literally, in the phrase that you heard, a big man on campus. And Bill was a real scholar himself. And so he had written, while he was at Yale, right after he graduated from Yale, but based upon his experiences at Yale, he wrote the book God and Man at Yale. You could pick it up today and you would say, gosh, that's what's happening on some of our campuses today. He was very prescient in the sense of detecting a drift in the economic field towards socialism, economic and political field towards socialism, and in the religious field towards an anti-religious attitude, way before it was obvious to any of us who were at Yale at the time. And needless to say, his book did not get total agreement with the people running the institution at the time, particularly the faculty. And so, but when this got him prominence in the country, this book, and particularly in this intellectual community. And then he did a number of other things that were extremely important. One of the things was that he started National Review, which started around 1955, and again is still going today, which has been the chronicle, if you will, the monthly chronicle of the conservative movement, which has engaged a number of top writers and has been able to give on both a current and an historic basis a great deal of information to those who are interested in conservatism. Well, Bill was also very significant in the transition from the intellectual movement, conservatism as an intellectual movement, to conservatism as a political movement. And in 1960, he gathered a group of young conservatives, people who were in college or just out of college, at his home in Sharon, Connecticut. And there they wrote kind of a manifesto of what modern conservatism should be. It was called the Sharon Statement, and namely because it was in Sharon that they drafted it. And this was attended by participants in what was a growing organization of young conservatives called Young Americans for Freedom. And this was a very singular event because it went beyond then simply thinking, talking, and writing about conservatism to actually action, political action, in which these people became involved. And of course, not too many years later, 1964, and the years running up to that, Barry Goldwater confirmed the conservative movement as a political movement when he ran for president in 1964. And while he didn't win, you might say that even without winning the presidency, he became one of the most influential figures in the history of conservatism because he recruited a lot of young people for his campaign. He recruited a lot of others as well, but it was mostly the fact that young people like those in Young Americans for Freedom who had a desire for the kinds of qualities that make up conservatism, freedom, opportunity, things such as that. They had this desire for that, and so they saw that in the United States in the campaign of Barry Goldwater for president in that year. And that developed the start of a cadre of conservatives, which has lasted up to the present time. And it was a very important cadre because as these people who had worked in the Goldwater campaign then continued to get together and to work together and to be involved in politics, not in one gigantic national organization by any means, but in terms of a lot of small organizations, a lot of small activities. The only national organization was really Young Americans for Freedom, but they were all active in the conservative movement in their own way, in their own areas. And it was this cadre that was absolutely critical to Ronald Reagan when he ran for the presidency for the first time in 1976, which I'll discuss in a few moments. Well, that was the second phase then. The third phase of conservatism in this country was turning conservatism into a governing movement. And that really started with Ronald Reagan in 1967 when he became governor of California. Conservatism was not really talked about much in political circles or in governing circles at that time. There were a lot of other phrases, you know, the New Deal, you'd had the New Deal, you'd had a lot of other movements and so on, the progressive movement way back in the early part of the 20th century, in the 1900s. But there wasn't an awful lot of matching of philosophy with actual governing, particularly from a conservative standpoint. And so that's what Ronald Reagan did as governor. He inherited a government in California which was virtually bankrupt. His predecessor had, through an accounting trick, had changed from one form of accounting to another, and in the course of that was able to spend 15 months of revenue in 12 months of actual activity. So the first thing that Ronald Reagan faced was literally a half-empty treasury without enough money to last out the fiscal year without borrowing. And in California, as in almost all states, you can't have deficit spending. And so he was forced in his first year in office to raise taxes. Now, for a person who had campaigned as a conservative and talked about the importance of keeping government within its budget, to discover that you now have to raise taxes was a terrible blow. But Ronald Reagan, true to his conservative ideals, told the people that he was going to, as he said, cut, squeeze, and trim the government. And if he was able to cut enough out of the government to get it back within its revenues, he would return all the additional taxes that were not needed. In other words, he would not allow the tax increase just to keep on and allow that to be a basis for government growing. And indeed he did. He had 3 different tax rebates to the people of California during the course of his 8 years in office. So it was, the reason he was able to cut, squeeze, and trim, by the way, was he recruited from the top businesses in California 250 of their top executives, brought them in for 6 months into the state government, had them go into every corner, every department, every agency, and come up with economies. The people who came from the phone company, for example, that time the Pacific Telephone Company, they found out how the state government could cut down, more efficiently utilize their telephone system and organize their telephone system and save a lot of money, even though it cost the telephone company revenue. They were very happy to do this in the interest of all the people of the state. And that went right through other businesses too. In their particular field of specialty, were able to recommend fleet management, all kinds of things, printing, recommend all kinds of economies. One that I've always thought was kind of interesting was that in the end of 1967, his first year in office, they mailed out some 3 months early the automobile license renewals. And the press was all over him, said, you know, this governor doesn't know what he's doing. They're not due until next March. Why is he mailing them out then? Well, what his people had discovered, our finance department had discovered, was there's going to be an increase in the postage in January. And so by mailing these things out, even though it was very early, we saved literally thousands of dollars of postage when you consider the number of people in California. I think it was about 28 million at the time. So you figure out the number of cars, that's a lot of stamp money. So, but it was those kinds of things. And the reason I say he started the governing movement is he proved that conservative ideas make sense and that they actually work in practice. And that's why this was such an important part of launching this new phase of conservatism, and that was the fact that these ideas really worked out in practice. The second major factor that I want to talk about is the message. And the message really is one that was derived from the best classical liberal and conservative thinking throughout history. And you know about that because as I read the syllabus, you've been doing a lot of that studying. I was impressed with, in looking at it, with the idea that these strains of thought could be kind of focused on the 4 cities, Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, and London. But the idea, at least as a way of kind of showing how these ideas developed in history. But it also included things like, the message includes things like what we learned from the Magna Carta, probably one of the most critical documents as far as what then later went on in what became the United States. English common law, Blackstone and others writing about that. And of course the key ingredient that went through all of these kinds of ideas was this idea of freedom and the idea of individuals having responsibility. And then of course the early writing of the founders, the work of Tocqueville and others. All of this is part of the message that was part of conservatism as it came to be integrated into what we now call the Reagan Revolution. Ideas, in other words, were very important. And there were several idea clusters at the time. One of the things that is remarkable that we'll talk about in the course of these remarks is the way in which differing ideas about conservatism were brought together into a comprehensive philosophy and a comprehensive strategy. George Nash, who's one of the authors that you've been reading in the book Reappraising the Right, talks about the conservative movement that came to power with Ronald Reagan. And he talks about it in terms of having 5 parts, 5 different, I would call them idea clusters, that came together. One was the classical liberals and the libertarians. And these were the people who were very much concerned about the threat of a powerful, overpowerful, if you will, government, and the idea of the welfare state and how this would be a threat to individual liberty as well as to free enterprise. And that was one group. Another were what you might call the traditionalists, and what George called the traditionalist conservatives, and they were worried about the fact that the ethical norms and the institutional foundations of American life were being weakened essentially at the hands of what were called secular and relativistic liberals. And it's sort of harking back to what Bill Buckley had talked about in God and Man at Yale. A third group were the anti-communist Cold Warriors. These are the people who were convinced that our country was increasingly imperiled by Marxism and particularly by the Soviet Union. A fourth group is what we call still today the neoconservatives. Thank you. And the neoconservatives, of course, are those people that Nash had an interesting phrase for it. He said they were liberals mugged by reality. And, that pretty well, I think, captures it. People who had liberal ideas, and in some ways, and I'll talk about that in a minute, Ronald Reagan was kind of one of these. They were, because they saw that liberalism wasn't working, they were gravitating towards something else. They probably wouldn't have admitted themselves that it was conservatism, but they were moving in that direction. And of course, one of the things that the Ronald Reagan Revolution did was give them a place where they could now be respectable as neoconservatives. And then the fifth group was the group, and that was the religious right, people who were more interested in the moral aspects of the way the country was going, people who had been concerned about the cultural wars of the 1960s and 1970s, and who were worried about that from a moral and religious standpoint. So it was a matter of bringing all 5 of these strains together as a part of getting the message across. Now, Ronald Reagan was a man of ideas. He had read extensively. He had thought deeply about history and political philosophy. And so he was able to bring these varied intellectual and political strains together into a comprehensive conservative message. George Nash described this as what he called a grand coalition. And so that was how there was a message, a philosophical foundation, if you will, to go along with the movement that I described earlier. Well, the third factor, of course, was the leader, a leader. You cannot have a movement without a leader, at least not one that's going to be successful. Professor Rufus Fears, who's a very insightful professor at the University of Oklahoma, has written a lot about leadership, going all the way back to the Greeks and Romans. And he describes the fact that the difference is, in order for a person to be a statesman rather than a mere politician, is to have 4 qualities, 4 characteristics. One is a bedrock of principle. Secondly, a moral compass. Third, a vision of where that leader wants to go or thinks that the country or organization should go. And fourth, the ability to communicate that vision and gain adherence. Well, Ronald Reagan, as a leader, had all of these qualities. As a bedrock of principles, his principles really were the same principles as the founders when he came to the presidency, and even as governor. Principles such as free enterprise, belief in free enterprise, individual freedom, a belief in the importance of limited government, those kinds of principles which characterized his governing as in both the state of California and in the United States. His moral compass was clear. He was a man of great integrity, a man of great courage, both physical and moral courage, and also a man of great perseverance. Once he had set his goals, he would not give up. He would continue to work for them. He had a vision. He had a vision of where the country ought to be going. And it was a vision in terms of returning to the basic principles and ideas of the founders, particularly a vision of the economics and the economic policies of the country, a vision of how a good president could govern, and particularly govern in accordance with that key sentence in the Declaration of Independence, which says that the only legitimate government is one that governs with the consent of the governed. And so this was a part of his vision of where America ought to be going. He also had a vision, by the way, in regard to the great threat that we had at the time, and that was the whole threat of communism and particularly the Soviet Union. And then his fourth area, of course, was a unique ability to communicate that vision and to gain the support of the people of the United States. There's one kind of interesting anecdote about that. His first speech to the people was from the Oval Office. It was shortly after he had taken office, and he was going to describe his economic program. And so he had he was sitting at his desk, and right behind the desk he had a chart, a whiteboard, something like that one over there, and he was going to draw a graph. And so in the afternoon he was practicing, and he had two of these pens, these markers, and so he drew the graph in one color, and then he showed how what was going to happen to the budget or the deficit if there was no change in the economy, and so he showed that with one line, one black line, and then he had a red line, and he showed how the economy would improve and overcome the deficit if we had a tax rate reduction, which is one of his proposals. That's what he was selling to the American people at the time. Well, when he finished practicing that, went back to his speech, forgot to put the caps on the pens. Well, you who've used those things know what happened. That night he gets up and he's in the middle of the speech, and he says, "I think I'll show you exactly what I mean." And he goes up there, and of course by that time they dried out, and so the pens didn't work. And but he didn't lose a beat. He put them back. He said, "Well, no, I think I'm going to tell you something else, and I'll go back to that later." Meanwhile, one of our staffers was crawling on the floor below the television cameras down and putting two new pens up there. At which time, after he'd crawled back, the president said, "But I think now's the time that I want to show you what this means," and goes back and it all worked. Well, what I say, he had these qualities of communication which are, I think, second to none among the presidents in our history. Well, how did Ronald Reagan get there? How did he get to be the kind of a leader that he showed when he was president? I would suggest to you that his leadership experiences were not unlike what you all are going through at the present time. I see by the collar insignia here that we got a lot of leaders in the room, and that's a natural part of what you're doing. It actually was for Ronald Reagan, as I'll mention. But he had been a leader most of his life. He'd been a president of his class in high school, president of the student body when he was in college, actually was a leader in the Army. In the 1930s, he enlisted in the Army as a private, in the Army Reserve, because he wanted to ride horses. And so he joined a cavalry troop at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, while he was a sportscaster there. He wanted to ride, but he had no money, and figured the best way to do that would be to ride as a soldier in reserve. But he wasn't content just with being a regular soldier and working his way up through the non-commissioned ranks. He took the special correspondence courses to become a second lieutenant. So when World War II broke out, he had a reserve commission as a second lieutenant and was called to active duty and did serve, ultimately rising to and was a captain by the time he left active duty at the end of World War II. But the Army provided him with the kind of formal leadership training and experience that he wouldn't have had otherwise. And so it was a very important part of this life of a potential leader of the country, and you might say enhanced his natural leadership capabilities with the kind of information that you all are learning in your military science courses. Well, an interesting thing about Ronald Reagan, that's what I meant when I was referring to the neocons, the neoconservatives. In his early life, his early adult life, he was a liberal. He was a self-proclaimed liberal. He even said on one occasion that he was a bleeding heart liberal. And I think it was derived from his strong religious background. His mother was extremely religious. She was the kind of lady that would literally visit the jails, taking food to the prisoners, helping out neighbors and all that sort of thing. And he kind of followed in that track as a young man, young boy, particularly a young man. And I think he was inspired by this idea, religious idea, that everyone should be his brother's keeper. It took a while for him to realize that when government is involved, far from helping you help your be your brother's keeper, that government often, when it strayed outside its own realm, was more likely to be your brother's master and yours as well. And so that was a change in his approach to government and to politics that took place really after probably around the 1950s or so. Now, before that time, however, and probably one of the things that started him thinking about this, he was the president of the Screen Actors Guild during the late 40s. Now, the Screen Actors Guild is the union of all the actors, and it's one of several unions in Hollywood. They have a union for the cameramen, union for the stage managers, a union for the grips and other people who help out in the movies, and so on. And so he was among these various union leaders. He was the leader of the Screen Actors Guild at a time when the Communist Party USA, the internal Communist Party in this country, tried to take over the unions as a means of taking over the movie industry, and they wanted to use movies for propaganda purposes. And so they literally were trying to take over each of these unions. Ronald Reagan led the other union leaders in resisting the communists, literally kicking them out in a very bitter war, actually, which did involve guns and tear gas and other things, and some really very strenuous activity to where they had strikes and all kinds of real major problems during that period of time. But that was where he got his idea of the threat of communism and his vision of communism and how to overcome the communists as he was able to at that time. Well, that education was extremely important because he not only started thinking and reading about communism as an internal threat, but also reading about communism in an international and worldwide sense. It just happens that the lawyer for the union, for the Screen Actors Guild, a friend of his, was an avid reader and writer on international communism, and he would provide books like The Treaty Trap and other things to Ronald Reagan, and he would devour this information and read it, and so he got quite an education at that point. And so I think that may have been part of the starting point for him to change some of the views that had occupied his mind up to then. As you may know from history, a good many of the people who were in Hollywood were seduced by the communist propaganda and actually became part of the communist movement at that time. Some of them got out of it later, but it was a big issue there for Hollywood during that period of time. Well, in the 1950s, Ronald Reagan was the host of a program, very popular program called the GE Theater, the General Electric Theater. Every Sunday night it was live, and he would be the host. Sometimes he'd play one of the characters in the episodes that they showed there. And part of his contract was that he would go around during the week to the General Electric plants. They had a big program of political education for their employees. And so they provided them with informational material, but they also had him go around. Being a movie star, he starred by that time in 51 movies, and being a star on television now, he was quite popular. People came out during their lunch hour in the various plants to see him. Over the course of 10 years, he visited 137 GE plants, and it was during that period of time that he talked with the workers about what their problems were. He talked with the managers, the supervisors about what their problems were. And then he also read a lot of the material that they were passing out. And so he started to have, again, from a more formal way, to learn about communism, about socialism, about the free enterprise system, and the threats to the free enterprise system. And so that was a very important part of his education as well, and I think finished the job of turning him from a liberal to a conservative. Now, one of the things that happened was he started, as a result, he became a very popular speaker. And so he was often asked to make, after he'd made these talks to the workers, people who'd heard him there would invite him back to Rotary clubs or Kiwanis clubs, service clubs, that sort of thing, to give talks on free enterprise. And so that was and then pretty soon political figures, particularly conservative political figures, would ask him to speak on their behalf. And so in 1962, he was speaking, and in the course of his speech, he remarked that he had been a lifelong Democrat, but now he was favoring this particular Republican candidate. And so during the question period, one of the ladies in the back of the room raised her hand and said, Mr. Reagan, you sound more like a Republican than you do a Democrat. And he said, well, I guess my views have really gone in that direction. He says, you know, I probably one of these days, if I find a registrar, I'll re-register. The lady said, I'm a registrar and I'll see you after the meeting. And so that's how he became a Republican. Now, it's hard to overstate the extent of Ronald Reagan's intellectual preparation for governing, although he probably didn't realize it at the time. But all of that reading that he did, and he had a wide variety of things that he read. He read Bastiat's The Law, for example. He read Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. He was fascinated with Whittaker Chambers' book, Witness, in which Whittaker Chambers talked about how he was more or less drawn into communism, and then how communism had failed. As a matter of fact, he even memorized parts of Whittaker Chambers' book, which he felt were particularly significant, and would use those in his speeches, speaking by heart. He also started regularly reading Human Events and also National Review, so he was up to date on the latest literature of the conservative movement. And so that was really a very important part of his preparation. But he had a particular interest in the history, the early history of this country, the founding. And he was just tremendously impressed by the biographies of the figures that were involved, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, all the rest, and also what they did and how they thought, particularly in terms of their altruism, how their willingness to put aside personal interests or even the interests of the states that they represented in order to put together and to create a single nation, a United States of America. You all remember in your history books how they had to nail shut the shutters on the windows of the building in Philadelphia so that the news media, even at that time, they had a little problem with the news media, so they wouldn't overhear what they were saying inside, because many of them were not necessarily just espousing what the people in their states wanted to hear, but were giving their own views about how we could have, in fact, bringing all the 13 states together into a single nation. And so that really interested him a great deal. He was fascinated by the Declaration of Independence, how that was really the creed, if you will, of freedom for our country, and particularly how the Constitution came to be, as in that Independence Hall in 1787. Now, it was this that was in his background when, in 1964, he was asked, having been a fairly prominent speaker in California at least, he was asked by a group of businessmen that if they would raise the money for a national telecast of him speaking on behalf of Barry Goldwater in the Goldwater campaign, would he do it? And he agreed to do it. And so they did raise the money themselves, so it wasn't out of the campaign coffers of Goldwater, and they put him on television. Well, he gave the speech entitled A Time for Choosing, where he explained the forces of liberalism versus the forces of conservatism, and what this meant to the people of the country, and that we had to choose one way or the other, and what would happen if we chose to give up the freedom and the principles of the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution and instead went towards a larger, more centralized, more powerful government, and towards what was the liberal direction that was being advocated by a number of the people at the time. And so this made such a hit that these businessmen saw what an ability he had, first of all, to promulgate a vision in line with what I had mentioned earlier and to gain adherence, that they asked him if he would run for governor of California. Well, Ronald Reagan said, they don't want an actor for governor. And the men said, well, you're more than an actor. He said, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I will take 6 months and I'll travel around California and talk to groups, and if there's any reaction of people being supportive of me running for governor, then I'll entertain it. Well, he did that. And just to show that he wasn't just an actor spouting lines that somebody else had written, what he did was he would talk for about 10 minutes. And then he would go for an hour, and they have them ask any questions they wanted about California government or what he planned to do, these kinds of things, so that it wasn't, so that they could tell for sure he was not just an actor, that he had some thought behind these things. And so that's what he did for about 6 months. He flew around the country, flew around California. The interesting part of that is he had never flown before. He hated to fly, and so he'd always traveled by train. Even when he went around the country for General Electric, part of his contract was he could always travel by train. That's why it took a week to get to some of these plants. But in any event, he finally had to give up and fly in the airplane, but he managed. And so he went around and got a tremendous response from the people of California, and that's how he ran for governor in 1966 against a very popular incumbent governor who was running for his third term. He won. As a matter of fact, his opponent, Governor Pat Brown, was overjoyed to hear that Ronald Reagan was his opponent, because as he said, I can beat an actor, certainly. As a matter of fact, he even had a rather nasty ad where he had a little girl, and a teacher was talking to a little girl and said, you know, it was an actor that shot Lincoln. That kind of promoted a reaction that was not too favorable by the people. Probably helped Ronald Reagan more than it did Pat Brown. In any event, Pat Brown was defeated by nearly 1 million votes in 1966, and that started Ronald Reagan on his political career. He did an outstanding job as governor. I mentioned a little bit about what he did with the deficit, erasing the deficit, putting into place sound fiscal policies. It was a period of a great deal of stress, because that was the late 60s and early 70s with the Vietnam War, the demonstrations, the disorders on campuses, all that sort of thing. And he was able to handle that with good planning, with good preparation, with personal involvement in talking to people, including talking to students. And one of them was he had a meeting of all the student body presidents of all the colleges in California there in the Capitol. And so he was explaining the importance of the foundations, the philosophical and political foundations of the country, the principles of freedom, the principles of individual responsibility, those kinds of things. So one of the student body presidents raised his hand and says, Governor, can I ask you a question? And the governor says, sure. And the student body president said, well, Governor, how do you expect us to adopt these kinds of ideas? Or how do you expect to understand what our thinking is? You know, we didn't have television. We didn't have coast-to-coast air travel. We didn't have people going to the moon. We didn't have any of these things. Rather, you didn't have any of these things, you and your generation. How can your generation understand us if you didn't have television, moon travel, transportation, all the rest? And Ronald Reagan said, no, my generation didn't have them. We invented them. He had that ability to really take any question and pretty well turn it back on the people, or at least answer it in a way that started them thinking. Well, this made him actually a national political figure as a result of what he was doing as governor of California, both the product, but also the talks that he was giving. He was asked to speak, and he had a platform to speak out on a nationwide basis as a champion of conservative ideas, a champion of the founding principles, and he talked a lot about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the example of the early leaders that he had studied so carefully in his early days. Well, this led him then, when he left the presidency, or the governorship in 1975, January of 1975, there was quite a groundswell that he ought to run for president in 1976, even though Gerald Ford, our president at that time, was going to run for re-election. And Ronald Reagan was uncertain whether he ought to do it, but what made him decide to run for re-election, even against an incumbent president of his own party, was he was dissatisfied with two things. One was the way in which the government had grown and was continuing to grow. And number two, the fact that we were not being tough enough in dealing with the Soviet Union. We were engaged in détente, what was called détente. In other words, the two in sort of an equilibrium. But what was happening is he knew from his own studies that the Soviet Union was cheating on this idea of détente, and they were moving ahead in their direction and towards their objectives while we were standing still and in effect letting them do it. And so it was these two things that that caused him to run for president against President Ford. Now, he, of course, did not win. He came pretty close. He got all the way to the convention, but he didn't win. And in many ways, it was probably a good thing he didn't, because I'm not sure that the country was ready for his ideas in 1976, as much so as they would be in 1980. But in any event, he did challenge him, and in the course of that, he enlarged this cadre that I talked about that started with Goldwater, because the people who had worked in his campaign continued as strong political activists, conservative activists, and so this enlarged really the group of people that were part of the conservative movement, particularly those who were interested in the political aspects of the movement. And so that was an important factor in moving the conservative ideals and the body of conservative people along. It's interesting, I think, to talk a little bit about his personal qualities and characteristics, because as has been mentioned in several books, somebody measured, I believe, recently that there were over 11,000 books written about Ronald Reagan, both in this country and elsewhere. But the question is, how does one man, we've had a number of presidents, we've had 44 presidents, how does one person stand out so much that even now, more than 22 years after he left office, he's still the president most talked about of any former president, even more so perhaps than the more recent presidents. And I think part of it was his personal qualities and characteristics. I often get a question when I talk to groups, what was Ronald Reagan really like? What was he like as a person? And I always answer that his most significant characteristic was his optimism and his cheerfulness. He was always upbeat. As he would say, he believed the glass was half full rather than half empty. And he kind of exuded that and invigorated others by his own optimism, and as a result he was able to inspire a team of people to do things that they didn't realize that when they started out that they were going to be able to do. And so he was literally an inspirational leader as well as an intellectual leader and a very good managerial leader. And he also had, and this was a very important part of his whole way of getting along with people and inspiring people, he had a great sense of humor, described by many of his people who wrote about him as a legendary sense of humor. And I usually get asked the question, well, what's my favorite Ronald Reagan story? I heard a lot of them in the course of the 30 years I had the privilege of working with him. Heard a lot of them many times, as a matter of fact. But he had stories about Hollywood, and he had stories about jokes and all this sort of thing. But my favorite is one that he told so many times. It was entitled The Central Intelligence Agency and an Irishman. And as he told this story back in the days when the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, was causing, they had the Troubles. You remember when they were fighting against the British in Northern Ireland. And they had come, several of their agents had come to this country to seek people of Irish ancestry to raise money. So the CIA decided they better find out what was going on over there. So they decided they would send an agent into deep cover to find out what was going on. And they had an agent by the name of Murphy. They thought that was a pretty good name for somebody going to Ireland. And so they bring Murphy in and say, Murphy, you're going to go into deep cover. Now, deep cover means what? No radio. Don't take a radio with you. Radio emissions would give you away. No telephone calls to the United States. No contact with headquarters whatsoever. And when we need your information, we'll send a courier over there to debrief you. And just so you know that the courier is authentic, there's a password. A few people have gone to spy movies, you always have to have a password. So the password was, "'Tis a fair day today, but tomorrow will be lovelier." They figured that you could work that into a conversation pretty easily. So off Murphy goes. A few months pass and they decide it's time to debrief him, so they dispatch the courier. The courier's not quite sure where to find him. He's supposed to be in this little village. So he starts there, and looking for an Irishman, he starts at the local pub. And so he goes in, he orders a whiskey. He was a very good agent. If he'd ordered a martini, he would have given himself away. So he orders a whiskey and engages the bartender in conversation. And they talk about the crops, they talk about the weather, and then he just says casually, he says, "By the way, I'm looking for a man named Murphy." Well, the bartender says, "We got a lot of Murphys around here. There's Murphy the bootmaker, he's got a little shop across the way. There's Murphy the farmer, he's got a place 2 miles down that way. And I just happened to be named Murphy also. Agent sips his drink and says, "'Tis a fair day today, but tomorrow will be lovelier." "Oh," says the bartender, "you want Murphy the spy. He lives around the corner." Well, that was typical Ronald Reagan. The last factor I want to talk about, and that is crisis. You remember Rahm Emanuel, if you've been following the current administration, remember Rahm Emanuel said, "Never waste a good crisis." In other words, that a president has more power to do things or more ability to do things if there is a crisis. Well, Ronald Reagan was sworn into office at the height of the greatest crisis we had had in several ways. Certainly the greatest economic crisis we had had since the Great Depression of the 1930s. We had inflation in those days of 12.5%. We had interest rates of 21%. Compare that with today when interest rates are barely 2%. Inflation is about the same. We had an energy shortage. I can remember getting up early in the morning to get my car. 5:30, you had to get your car in line at the local gas station because by 8:30 they would have sold all the gas they had for that day. So we had a real problem there. We had, the country was really, had an unemployment situation which was extremely serious. It was not, it actually got up at one point up as high as 10%. That was in terms of the economy. We likewise had a great crisis in terms of foreign affairs and national security. For one thing, there was the threat of communism and particularly the Soviet Union, which was a real threat because their potential for aggression was great. They had actually just in two years before the end of 1979, they'd marched with impunity into Afghanistan. Likewise, they were using Cuban troops in Angola to subvert the government of Angola. They had a Marxist bastion in our own hemisphere in Nicaragua, and they were subverting El Salvador and their neighbor, and we were trying to take over the government of El Salvador. So we had all of these things, plus the fact that Ronald Reagan was very disturbed about the captive nations. A good portion of Eastern and Central Europe was under the heel, if you will, of the communists of the Soviet Union, and there was great oppression of the people there, such as in Poland and various other countries, where the people were literally under martial law and under military dictatorships. That was one problem as far as a threat to the country. A second major problem was that our military capability had deteriorated from the end of the Vietnam War, 1973-74, in that period, so that we were at one of the weakest points we'd been, certainly the weakest point since World War II. As they said at the time, we had planes that couldn't fly for lack of spare parts. We had ships that couldn't sail for lack of trained crews. We had Army tanks and artillery pieces that couldn't maneuver for lack of either ammunition or fuel. And so our military situation was extremely dire. The third part of that threat to national security was our position of world leadership. We were no longer as respected as we had traditionally been since the end of World War II. The pundits were saying that capitalism had peaked and that democracy was as wide as it was ever going to go, and that the wave of the future was socialism. They looked at what was happening actually in Africa, in Asia, even in Latin America, and they were predicting that we would be moving more in a socialist and in a less democratic direction. And also there were many people who engaged in what we call moral equivalence, and that was that freedom and democracy and totalitarianism were just two different ways of operating countries, that there was no moral difference between them. Well, these were things that Ronald Reagan absolutely despised, that kind of thinking. And then, of course, the third major problem that we had as a country was the spirit of the American people. It was described that people, because of the economic problems, because of the military lack of capability, because of the other kinds of problems that I mentioned, the people felt that America's days were not yet the best to be ahead, but rather that we were in a declining position as a country. They lost self-confidence in the country, in themselves, and in our institutions. Well, obviously with all of these problems, you might say the time was right for a conservative leader with a conservative message to mobilize the conservative movement and undertake what we now call the Reagan Revolution. Well, when Ronald Reagan took office, he started from the guiding principles that I mentioned earlier. They came from the conservative message itself. They came from the American political experience, particularly the founding. And they consisted really about perhaps 6 major ideas. One, the importance of constitutionalism and the rule of law, following what the Constitution said, obeying the Constitution. Secondly, preserving individual liberty, the freedom of the people. Third, limited government, keeping government within the bounds such as the founders had in mind when they wrote the Article 1, Section 8, in which they said there are enumerated powers for the federal government, and beyond that they should not go. Another principle was free market economics, particularly important in terms of dealing with the economic problems. Traditional American values, our emphasis as a country on things like religion and family as the moral foundations of the nation, and finally a strong national defense. So these were the principles, and from these principles came the policies and actions of his administration. His first act, for example, even before he left the Capitol after being sworn in, was to go to a little room there and sign an order, a first executive order, abolishing the price controls which had been hobbling our energy resources. Beyond that, he did a number of things. In terms of the economic problems, he had got through Congress tax rate reductions. When he took office, the marginal tax rates were 70%. He cut those way down, ultimately to 28% as the highest rate. And of course, he had tax rate reductions across the board. He didn't believe in this class warfare idea. He felt everybody should be treated equally, no matter what their taxes happen to be. Also, regulatory reform, discarding unnecessary and burdensome regulations that were stifling business and industry. He worked with the Federal Reserve, for a stable monetary supply. He slowed the growth of federal spending. As a matter of fact, for the 8 years that he was president, you had the slowest increase in federal spending of any president since World War II. In the terms of the military, he rebuilt our military. He increased, we had an all-volunteer military. Some of you may know the history of that, and it was in jeopardy, actually, in 1980. He increased the pay, improved the budget, improved the living conditions of our personnel, gave a lot of emphasis to personnel matters in the military, and showing pride in our men and women in the armed forces. He also rebuilt and expanded our strategic weaponry. He expanded our conventional weapons, particularly modernizing our tanks and artillery pieces and ships, worked towards building a 600-ship Navy, worked also on our intelligence system, as well as working on our industrial mobilization capabilities, and particularly started something that was very important to him, and that was finding a means of defense against strategic nuclear weapons. And that was why he started work towards the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was an anti-ballistic missile program, which of course is still going today. He also revised our approach to the Soviet Union. He took on the Soviets on a moral plane. He said that people who live by oppressing others that are not, as he called it, the epitome of evil in the world. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire. And it was very interesting because a lot of the New York Times and other pundits thought that was just terrible, provocative, and so on. A lot of the people in what I call the striped pants set at the State Department were quite upset. Ronald Reagan said, look, they know they're evil. The people that they're oppressing know they're evil. Why don't we admit that they're evil? And so that was a very key thing that he did, which started to give hope to the people behind the Iron Curtain that there was an American president who not only knew what the situation was, but was going to say it as it actually was. And then also, he let it be known through ambassadors that we would not stand for any further aggression, and that if they tried to move into any other countries, we would join the other nations of the West to take action against them. And then he went beyond that and worked with freedom fighters in Angola, in Nicaragua, in Poland, and elsewhere to roll back the aggression that the Soviets had already engaged in. He also reestablished our position of world leadership, working with Margaret Thatcher particularly, so that once again we were respected by the other countries. And also he revived the spirit of America through his talks to them on television and otherwise, saying that our best days are yet ahead, and really revived that can-do spirit. The other thing that he did was very important in terms of the principle of the Constitution and the rule of law, and that is the fact that he took great pains to state the importance that judges should not rule on the basis of politics or their own ideas, but that they should rule on the basis of what the Constitution says and what the laws passed by Congress actually say, and not act like legislators or Constitution writers themselves. This has been quite an issue because the courts had strayed far from a constitutionally faithful path from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so his appointment of judges was extremely important. And not only his appointment of judges, but his espousing the importance of sticking to the Constitution and following the Constitution, which was not only the basis for selecting judges, but as a means of moving us back towards a more constitutional republic, which he was very much involved in himself, and also provided the inspiration for the rest of us. Ken mentioned that in his kind introduction, but that was one of the tenets of our work in the Justice Department, was to move in a constitutional direction and to assist the President in finding judges who would be faithful to the Constitution. Well, that really is kind of a summary, if you will, of how the President was able to provide the leadership for the Reagan Revolution. A lot of attention was paid to personnel. The people who were appointed, he paid a lot of attention to it himself, because he knew that personnel is policy. The kind of people you appoint, what their philosophy is, what their beliefs are, it's going to indicate what they're going to do. Secondly, he had the idea that we should be a team. People may have differences, but once he had made a decision, he expected everybody to be part of the team carrying out and implementing those decisions. He spent a lot of time personally in the policy-making business. He didn't allow people to come in and get a quick decision out of him in the Oval Office. He felt that everybody, he used the cabinet, the 18 of us who were members of the cabinet, as his primary forum for decision-making. And he felt that way he would get a lot of different points of view, a lot of different ideas. And he always said, the more information I get, the better job I do of making decisions. And so he used that as a part of the team building, but also as a very important source of his decision-making. And he also spent a lot of time with the military. He visited military posts to show the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines and Coast Guardsmen that he had a personal interest in them. And that went a long ways towards instilling their morale and instilling their enthusiasm for the work they were doing. He also recognized conservatives, and this was an important part. Other presidents, some had given short shrift to the conservatives. They didn't think that they were very important. He let conservatives, people in the conservative movement, know that he was one of them and that he appreciated what they were doing. He did this in a lot of ways. There's a conservative political action conference each year. We had one just a few weeks ago. And he, for each of the 8 years that he was president, he attended or gave a speech by television to that conference, so that these several thousand conservatives would know that he wanted them to understand that he was a supporter of theirs, and that what they were doing was important. Likewise, he awarded the Medal of Freedom and other presidential awards to conservative leaders for what they had done in terms of their service to the country. And finally, a lot of what he did to get his points of view across, but also to show that conservatism works, that conservatism was something that people could embrace, and that was through his speeches to the country. His speeches, as I mentioned earlier, he had this ability to communicate his vision, but his speeches were very inspirational to the country, and that was a big part of how he's able to succeed. In short, what he did was, I think, best described by George Nash in his book Reappraising the Right, when he said, he transmuted American conservatism from theory to practice. He gave conservatives a successful presidency to defend and a statesman to honor, and shifted the paradigm of political discourse for at least a generation. We now know it'll be probably more than a generation. It'll probably be many generations, of which you all are a part. Thank you.
I'm here with Mr. Ed Meese, the 75th Attorney General of the United States, and Mr. Ken Cribb, who was head of domestic policy for Ronald Reagan and also was an assistant to Ed Meese in the Justice Department. Gentlemen, questions? Mr. Slater?
Question for either you, Mr. Cribb, or for Attorney General Meese. Just trying to apply what you were saying about the reasons for the Reagan Revolution, is that you had to have the movement, the message, the leader, and the crisis. And so in the current times, we kind of have that economic downturn, just like we did during Reagan's time, and the political disillusionment that we had in the 70s. We've had a number of movements that have been arising: the Occupy movement, the Tea Party movement, and the Ron Paul movement. But where those seem to diverge is that the Tea Party movement and the Occupy movement don't really have a message. They don't really have a leader. Whereas Ron Paul kind of has that libertarian message and the leader. Do you see any of those movements, or in particular the Ron Paul movement, really going forward in the future in a similar way as the Reagan?
Well, I think of all of them, the one that has the most permanence probably is the Tea Party movement, in the sense of being a major movement, because it has now lasted since after 2008. It formed around the elections of 2010, of course, was very successful in 2010, has elected a number of people who are now in Congress, who will be running, many of them in the House will be running again. So I think that the Tea Party, and the fact that the Tea Party doesn't have a leader in the sense of a national leader, one of its strengths was that it was, I won't say leaderless, but it was not built around a particular person. It was around a set of ideas. And these were basically the same ideas of the founders: respect for the Constitution, fidelity to the Constitution, limited government, freedom, not having exorbitant taxes, those kinds of things. So I think that will. Now, I think in terms of the libertarian movement that is behind Ron Paul, that will continue as a small, I won't say fringe group, but as a smaller group, will probably continue because, again, it's built around a philosophy of which Ron Paul happened to give it national prominence now. But I would say it will probably not grow an awful lot because it is a relatively limited philosophy, and it doesn't take into account a lot of things that are important in the political world. In terms of the Occupy movement, it seems to me that it's kind of a nihilist movement. You don't know exactly what they're for, other than the fact that they know there's a difference between 1 and 99, and even there, I don't think they're accurate in their percentages. But in any event, it's hard to say what they're for, except they're against everything. And movements that are just against things haven't been too successful in our political realm.
Now, we will have a gentleman by the name of Senator Rand Paul in our last session, which will be session 13. And a number of people consider him one of the principals of the Tea Party movement. But I think he's more than that, and he'll be talking about what he sees as the future of the conservative movement, and it'll be a panel with a number of people, as you know.
Could I just respond as well in saying that, and answer your question? First, I'd say that the Tea Party movement, as it is interpreted by media pundits, is sometimes, I think, underestimated. It's really a fairly sophisticated position. When it understands better than most recent Republican politicians, for example, the connection between the size of government and freedom, or how much money we're spending in freedom. These are converse factors. In other words, the Constitution it protects us from concentrations of power, and this is what the theme that the Tea Party is gathered around. So I think the typical is thinking of unsophisticated. No, these are people much like us who are successful in everyday life, who have actually become motivated by the dire situation with the overspending and huge deficits that they believe will eventually diminish our freedom. In that sense, I think they're most sophisticated than the typical politician. Could I also say that what you were doing was describing what I would characterize as sub-movements of what the Attorney General described as a grand coalition. So it's not necessary, if the sum of the parts, the sum of the whole is greater than these individual parts. And we have been able to find common cause at the level of government. Libertarians and the social conservatives will never agree on certain items, but they tend to agree on the political issues that engage in a presidential election. And I think when Ronald Reagan had these 60% majorities, these huge landslides, it's because he held all these people in coalition, and it can be done.
Next question. Mr. Salmaska.
Sir, you spoke briefly about the folks living behind the Iron Curtain. How much, the fall of the Soviet Union eventually, how much was it due in part to its own people, their own loss of faith, and did Reagan energize that dissatisfaction? Or, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think you have different groups. You had the people in the Soviet Union itself, the people who were oppressed by their own leaders, and then you had the people in the captive nations. And I think Ronald Reagan had an impact on all of them. One of the things that he did was, of course, he employed all the organs of power in terms of dealing with the Soviet Union: economic power, political power, diplomatic power, military power, and you might say cultural power as well. And he used them in different ways. But one of the things he did was, if the Soviet Union had had their way, the leaders there, they would have been able to slack off on their spending, and as a result would make life a little more bearable for the people in Russia itself, in the Soviet Union itself. But because they were putting such a large amount of their resources into the military, in Afghanistan as well as the military generally, things were pretty dire for the people within the Soviet Union itself. And so we used economic power to make it hard for them. We also, by building up our military, it meant that they could not have military superiority on the cheap, which was what they were moving towards in the 1970s. Now, so that's the Soviet people. I think also, to some extent, our radio liberty and other things, I think this did cause some dissatisfaction among the Soviet people, but it was mainly aimed at the people behind the Iron Curtain. And there is where I think our efforts, we had people, for example, some of the people who were affiliated with Heritage were smuggling into the captive nations Xerox machines and other means of communication and providing information. And the other organizations, the USIA, had regular programs into these to give people hope. I think what Ronald Reagan did by his leadership was give the people behind the Iron Curtain hope that things were going to get better. And even in the Soviet Union, people were being imprisoned there. I had an occasion after the wall came down and after the Soviet Union imploded to talk to some people who had been in prison in Russia. They'd been Russian citizens, but they were in prison, and they heard that I was from the Heritage Foundation, and they were all excited. They said, "We prayed for you while we were in prison," and I said, "Well, that's very nice. How did that come about?" They said, "Well, Pravda," that was the Soviet newspaper, "Pravda said such bad things about you. We knew you must be good." So I would say that Ronald Reagan, that first of all, the things that Ronald Reagan did all set in motion the forces that ultimately led to the wall coming down. And there's no question that our combination of all of these different techniques had a major impact on that. Now, the other thing he did, I think, was actually have an influence on Gorbachev. If Gorbachev had followed in 1989, 90, and 91 in the pattern of his predecessors, then he would have used the troops to quell any kind of an uprising. They would have used the troops in East Germany to keep the wall from coming down. They would have done these things. I think Gorbachev knew, because he now had been exposed to a great deal to the West, because he'd been in this country to some extent, but he'd also had a certain amount of contact. And I think that is what constrained him, what made him think about perestroika, which was change, and glasnost, which was more transparency. As he was thinking about these things, I think that was, Ronald Reagan had a lot of influence on him in that regard. So I think in multiple ways, I think that without Ronald Reagan, you would not have had the wall come down, you would not have had the Soviet Union implode, at least in the time span that it did. It might have happened 10 years later, it might have happened 20 years later, but I think there's no question that all the things he did, including things that were not generally known, such as preventing the exploitation of the oil that the Soviets did, which they could then transfer into hard cash. We kept pipe layers and other kinds of technology from them. There were a lot of things that happened at that time.
I have,
Ken.
The Attorney General has put out this construct. I could give you 3 quick illustrations that are very concrete to illustrate his general argument here. On the pipelines, which he ended with, the Soviets tried their old trick of trying to steal technology to increase the flow of oil into Europe to get hard cash because they were strapped for hard currency. And our intelligence, this has now been declassified, but our intelligence picked up that they were attempting to steal it, so we supplied it to them. We made sure they got this technology, but with a few little modifications. And by the time they employed the technology, they had 2 pipelines. On the second of the 2 pipelines, our satellites picked up the largest man-made explosion ever detected on planet Earth, which completely obliterated the second pipeline. Another illustration of Ed's points, talking about providing encouragement. Matt, this goes exactly to your point, providing encouragement to those still behind the Iron Curtain. Natan Sharansky was the most prominent of what's called the refuseniks, the Russian intellectuals who, as a matter of principle, took a stand, knew they would be imprisoned in the Gulag, and were in fact imprisoned. And the Gulag was teeming with people like that. He was the most prominent. And he says that they would communicate with each other by tapping on the radiators in code. You couldn't do it very long at a time. You'd get caught, right? So it was always quiet and just a few little minutes. He said that when word got to the Gulag of the president's evil empire speech that the Attorney General described in his remarks, he said you could hear those radiators all over the prison, just clanging away. In other words, it thrilled them and it gave them hope. And I do think that Reagan's leadership in that regard was quite important.
Cadet Thomas.
So as with any politician, Reagan obviously had his critics. For example, Richard Gamble here in the American Conservative wrote that many historians consider Reagan's foreign policy Wilsonian, that it may have in fact paved the way for the larger, more centralized government instead of countered this. What would you say to that?
Well, I don't know much of the evidence that Gamble gives for that, but I would say that one of the aspects of the principles that I talked about was a strong national defense. And I think when you had an adversary such as the Soviet Union, it behooved the president to take whatever actions were necessary. But I would say that there was a minimal impact upon the United States itself. For example, we no longer had a draft. He was very much in favor of the all-volunteer force. And so we had a volunteer military, so that there was less interference with the freedom of individuals to decide whether or not they wanted to join the armed forces. There was certainly no diminution of our economic strength during that time. That was the period of the greatest economic growth in the history of the country. So I'm not quite sure what he's talking about there. And actually, during that period of time, we did not have an enlargement of the federal government. We had, as I mentioned, slowing the growth of federal government, the growth that is natural in terms of inflation and population increase. So I don't think that, and certainly the power of the federal government did not increase during that time in terms of its relationship to our citizens. If anything, there was a great effort to increase freedom and to push more power and authority down to the states rather than have it remain at the federal government level. One of Ronald Reagan's main criticisms, which I didn't have time to go into, of Gerald Ford, was that since you had at that time 2 major waves of government growth. One was in the 1930s with the New Deal, one in the 1960s with the so-called Great Society, and one of his criticisms was that neither the Nixon administration nor the Ford administration decreased government. Ronald Reagan, in fact, did, in program by program, turning powers back to the states, having a executive order that any regulation had to be examined to make sure it did not interfere with the state's power of the separate states, and also turning back authority in several other areas, which had been through welfare reform, which was a part of the things that he did during his presidency.
Did you want to comment?
Only to this extent. I know Richard Gamble well, I'm his publisher, and I just think he's wrong on this point. And I think what there's a facile analogy that works at one level. Wilson was an internationalist. Reagan was active internationally. But distinguish between being active internationally to eliminate threats to freedom or going further and being active in actually trying to make everybody a democracy that looks like in America. Reagan never did he was for freedom. Democracy had to take care of itself, but he was for freedom. Now, some people who supported Reagan in doing that or liked what he did there take it further and think we have to, the secret is on having a majoritarian election, and suddenly that's in our interest. I don't think that is in our interest necessarily. That's other people's business, and Reagan never went that far. So I think the analogy fails.
Yeah, that's a good point. Ronald Reagan never felt that we should impose our views, democracy or whatever, on other countries, but that we should support democratic movements in those countries. And that's what he did in all of that support from freedom fighters. He was supporting them. He was not trying to come in and impose something on them.
And that is a major difference of policies of our past presidents, immediate past presidents. Yes, Mr. Ford, please.
Sir, you kind of just hit on my question in a way, but do you fear that the Reagan defense strategy has been or somewhat outdated and unsuccessfully adopted by 21st century neoconservatives in the contemporary foreign policy? I mean, you hit on the crisis that Reagan had. We don't necessarily have that crisis. We're still spending exorbitant amounts on defense spending, but we don't have that imminent threat of Sharia law in America like we did with communism at that time. Is there kind of a disconnect there?
Well, I think that our needs are, in terms of military capability, are real today, because there are, they're real enemies against the United States. We've seen examples of it in terms of the terrorism attacks within the United States and the terrorism attacks overseas. The question is, how much of a military do you need? I think that, for example, I consider Iraq primarily an intelligence failure, and that is the intelligence agencies of all the countries told us that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. We know he had used weapons of mass destruction when he gassed the people in the early part of the 1990s. So I always say, in terms of looking at the situation George W. Bush found himself in, if you look at the criticism of the FBI for not discovering and preventing the Twin Towers, the World Trade Center, from being bombed, which at the time nobody was thinking of, and that's why it's kind of silly to say that they should have stopped it. Think if George Bush had said, well, we're not going to go in after, and Saddam Hussein did in fact have these weapons of mass destruction and lobbed a number of them into Israel, or for that matter into any of the capitals of Europe. Think of the criticism that would have come to him. Now, on the other hand, if we had better intelligence, and remember, intelligence was essentially ruined in the 1970s by the Church Committee and by during the Carter administration, when wholesale 700 agents or career officers were fired or retired, and they lost then their networks of informants and that sort of thing. So I think if we'd had better intelligence, I doubt if we would have gone into Iraq. Now, there's no question that our purpose in Afghanistan was to deny sanctuaries and deny bases for al-Qaeda and the terrorists, and the Taliban decided to side with al-Qaeda and to be supportive of al-Qaeda, at least in fighting against us. And so I think that most of the things we've had to do, that prudence would indicate it. After the fact, it's often easy to say we shouldn't have had either war, but I think it's probable that we had to go into Afghanistan to wipe out the bases for the al-Qaeda particularly. We probably could have, we might have been able to do better in terms of dealing with the Taliban, but we're dealing with a country that's never had a central government, so it's very difficult. So the hazards there, or the obstacles, are great. In terms of Iraq, if we had not gone into Iraq, we would not have had the stresses and the operating tempo on our military that we have at the present time. But I can't see in the near future lowering our operating tempo much below what we're doing now in terms of having people around the world for hot spots that may come up. And Ronald Reagan always felt, as I do, that you've never gotten into a war by being too strong. Now, and actually the percentage of gross national product that we're devoting to the military now is relatively small compared with John F. Kennedy and most other presidents who've had a situation where there's an existentialist enemy, or either for us, enemies for us or for our allies.
I'll just say that I agree with what the Attorney General just said. I think the absolute amount we're spending on the military is great, counting the war expenditures. But I would say that the amount we're spending on general readiness is been declining ever since Reagan. And it's getting critical. I mean, Reagan brought, as Attorney General noted, and as we discussed in class earlier today, brought the Navy up to 600 ships. It's
Or
now
near it, not quite.
well, actually, it reached it one day, and then decommissioning always takes it back down. This is according to John Lehman, but anyway.
He was Secretary of the Navy.
He was Secretary of the Navy. He was counting. In any event, we're less than 300, moving toward 250.
Yeah.
Ed's son, Colonel Meese at West Point, is one of the great experts on American readiness. So I think distinguish between the gross amount spent and where we're spending it. I think that in this electoral campaign, there will probably be an issue on rebuilding the essential parts of the military. For example, modernizing the nuclear deterrent, that sort of thing, which hasn't been touched in many a year in terms of modernization. So I wouldn't want you to think that just because a lot of money is being spent because of war expenditures that our military readiness is in good repair. I don't think it is.
One other thing that I think is important, we have tended to do what most organizations do, and that is we tend to increase at the top, and today we have a far too large a Pentagon. I think we could cut the Pentagon in half, both let the civilians go and take the military back and make them go to work in productive activities. Because if you look at what happened during the Clinton administration, we literally doubled the top echelon of the Pentagon. There were 2 undersecretaries, today we have 5, and then all those undersecretaries have deputy assistant undersecretaries and deputy assistant undersecretaries. So we've become somewhat muscle bound from a management and leadership standpoint. We could be a lot more lean than we are. In the actual fighting services, I think we've tried to do that. The new construct of our brigades and that sort of thing is a lot more mobile, a lot more lean than divisions were, for example, which was our principal large units before.
Next question. Mr. Lacey and then Cadet Faust.
My question is kind of a follow-up to Mr. Ford's. You mentioned the Grand Coalition and Reagan bringing together the different conservative groups, and that's the basics of the conservative movement today. But the big reason he was able to do that seemed to be having the common enemy in communism. And so, do we need that common enemy for the Grand Coalition to stay together, and have we played up the threat of radical Islam in the effort to keep the Grand Coalition together? And if we don't have that, does the coalition fall apart?
Yeah, I believe that the coalition can stay together, and a lot of us are working on showing how each of the 3 legs, so-called, of the conservative stool, the national security conservatives, economic conservatives, and social conservatives, really need each other and are affected by the primary focus of interest of the other groups. And so I don't believe that we're artificially exaggerating the threat from Islam or from Islamists, but really the threat goes beyond that. It really is the threat of rogue states and terrorist organizations. We have rogue states in terms of Iran, North Korea, with nuclear weapons potential in both of them, certainly with ballistic missile capabilities in both of them. We have terrorist groups. There are other branches of Al-Qaeda beyond those that are in Afghanistan and Pakistan. There are other potential terrorist groups around the world. So I think we have to maintain a state of readiness that is reasonable concerning the threat. At the same time, I don't think we need to, I don't think we should exaggerate the threat, and I don't believe we are. But I think that readiness is something that makes the world, is a requirement, because the world is still a dangerous place. And basically, you contain and you prevent conflagrations, or what we might call a hot war, a shooting war, by having the strength to deter and to impress upon a potential enemy that they cannot succeed.
Yes, I would say that it's a very good question, and there's literature, there's speculation about this in the literature. I would say the proof is in the pudding in some ways. Ed chairs a group that, a volunteer group of leaders of the conservative movement that works on unity among the organizations. And I have been observing this now since I was your age, and I've never seen it more unified. So the proof is in the pudding somewhat. We have more than 100 CEOs of principal conservative organizations that are working together rather easily and with less natural turf and other kinds of conflicts than I've ever seen. So I think we just, empiricism works. You need to look at what's happening to test a theory about what's happening. And empirically, the conservative movement is working well together. I would also say that there's more than one kind of threat, and it's not just foreign military threat that's at issue here. There's also the question of remaining true to the United States Constitution and the engine of prosperity that has gotten us where it has gotten us. And there is a threat to that from the current administration. And I think the current administration tends to unify conservatives.
I was just going to add something in here. I look at the Reagan era as an era of anti-New Deal, anti-communism, and recovering in the Americans, and a recovery of the American spirit. Religiosity increasing. You talked before about it really being about Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan working together being of vital importance. Wouldn't you put Pope John Paul II in there as well as almost a triad?
Very definitely. I think there's no question. Books have been written on this. They're pretty accurate. But there's no question that the Pope had a major influence. First of all, he came from one of the captive nations, from Poland. Actually, it was not part of the original captive nations, but it was certainly oppressed into the 1980s. And so his religious and spiritual leadership was a very important thing there, and in much of Central and Eastern Europe, particularly. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and the Pope did not sit down together and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. But they had similar objectives, they had similar philosophies, and they did communicate with each other so that none of the three were surprised by what the others did. And so that there was a continual lines of communication among the three, some more direct between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, some less direct but definitely there through intermediaries with the Pope and the other two.
I agree with what the Attorney General said. We've been allies a long time. It's not news that we agree with each other. But let me point out that this Protestant from Illinois, middle of the country, Illinois, low church Protestant that Ed was talking about, was the president who also opened diplomatic relations with the Vatican. Not only did he open diplomatic relations with the Vatican for the first time in American history, formal exchange of ambassadors, he sent as his ambassador the chairman of his kitchen cabinet, and everyone knew he was the chairman. In other words, this was a sign of how important that the importance he placed. And I believe the second ambassador to the Vatican was Frank Shakespeare, who was one of our great strategists. He had been head of the radios under Nixon, the outreach arm of American, shall we call it, public diplomacy, and very plugged in insider in both conservative intellectual circles and the Reagan administration. So he didn't just open relations with the Vatican, he signaled the importance with his importance. And in terms of Thatcher, everyone knows the great working relationship. I'll just add, I'm doing the color commentary, giving the examples of the theories. His last call, his last official act in the Oval Office was to call Margaret Thatcher.
Cadet Faust.
When we were talking in our study group, we seemed to find that there was a lot of parallels between the situation and leading up to the Reagan administration and the situation today. And Reagan managed to take it and turn it into the conservative movement and be able to make the conservative movement mainstream. What should the conservative movement today take from that and apply so that way we have that? Or is it just not the right time yet? Has America not hit rock bottom and ready to be taken out of that?
Well, I think that there is a great opportunity today, because one of the things that has happened by this administration is in the things that I mentioned about the economy, tax rate reduction, regulatory relief, stable monetary policies, and slowing the growth of federal spending. This administration is going 180 degrees in the opposite direction in all four of those. So I think what is lacking today is a source of accurate and credible communications by conservatives. I think that's the greatest need for conservatives today, is the ability to get their voice across. And obviously, anybody who's in the White House has a greater bully pulpit, as they talk about, from which to speak. But I've been somewhat disappointed that the other organs of government, particularly in the Senate and the House, have not had a better means and a better capability of communicating their messages across to the American people.
Could I just say that I think that in part this is a generational problem, and that the demographics of the conservative intellectual revival is about to overtake the demographics of the leadership of the Republican Party. We see in the House, for example, a very substantial backbench of strong conservatives who want that message to be enunciated with clarity and who are acting in accord with that. And I was on a committee that was seeking to endorse a presidential candidate, had some funds, and we didn't endorse because of our assessment of the current conditions. But what we found in our research was that there are dozens of people ready to run the next time. So I think in part this is time, and I think time is on our side.
Yes, Cadet Mellon.
I was just going to ask, what role do you think the primaries have in helping or hurting the Republican Party convey this message that we are talking about?
Well, I think that there have been some very unwise choices from a strategic and also a tactical standpoint in the workup to the election. I think, for one thing, having 21 debates is not a very good idea, number one. Number two, to have the news media, which is not interested in the best interests of the Republican Party, to provide the moderators for the debates, where much of their time has been trying to focus one candidate against another and ask questions, which creates more controversy than it does statements either about what they would do against the other party, or in terms of the campaign against the other party, or what they would do in terms of governing if they had the majority or had the White House. And so I think that's been very serious. There's already talk within the Republican Party about the Republican National Committee taking on the campaign in 2016 and limiting the number of debates, determining who should be the moderators, and getting more control of this. I think it's out of control now. This has been compounded by the candidates violating what Ronald Reagan always said was the 11th commandment, and that was that Republicans do not attack each other personally. And there's been far too much of personal attacks rather than disagreeing on the issues, which is fair game, or even talking about someone's past positions. But when you make it a matter of character assassination, personal mendacity, and wrongfulness, then I think you're going overboard. And we've had so much of that. And the press, the media eats this up. They love it. for two reasons. Most of them are liberal and are not sympathetic to the Republican cause, and secondly, it makes news. But the purpose of running for the presidency should not be to make news, it should be to try to get your point across. And I think that if you had to go out today and say, okay, what would this candidate or that candidate do if they're president, you know a lot more about how they would attack their colleagues or their competitors than you do about what they would do as president.
Next question. Yes, Captain McGurk.
Sir, you brought up Hayek's Road to Serfdom as a source of at least some inspiration for Reagan's economic policies. But if that worked possibly because of President Reagan, the American people's trust and faith in President Reagan as a political leader, do you believe Hayek's philosophy would be just as successful today without that source of a popular or trusted leader?
No, I think having a popular and trusted leader is very important to it. I think the philosophy itself makes a lot of sense, but I think people need a context within which to understand the philosophy unless they've been working in that field or studying that field for a long period of time and understand what he was saying and why he was saying it and some of the other writings and that sort of thing. So you need, when you have some ideas that are of political philosophy, you need a protagonist, someone who will interpret that to the public so that they understand what they're talking about and what the dangers are. And so in order to make that real, you have to have an understanding of history and philosophy and politics and how governments work. And that's what Ronald Reagan was able to do. He was able to take fairly complex subjects and make them understandable to people. And that's the fourth prong of Professor Fear's list of qualities, and that is the ability to explain things to adherents so that they'll follow what you're talking about.
Before I go to Ken Cribb, in other words, he's saying you need to take courses like this.
Well, that's right. That's right.
Very good point. And I'm delighted that this question is proceeding from having read Hayek. Until Reagan, politicians trying to defend the Western way argued it in terms of economic efficiency. In other words, this is, if you go the other way, you'll be less prosperous. That is true, and it's been borne out by history, but it is not a sufficient argument. It is not a sufficient vision. Reagan argued in terms of freedom, that this is human freedom, and that freedom is the value we're advancing, not prosperity as a first instance. The prosperity comes from freedom. So, and that Hayek would certainly agree with that assertion. So that let me just say that, agreeing once again with Ed, that Reagan put together a overall vision that appealed not just to the head but to the heart.
I might say that when you mention this class, I think what you're doing is really critical because we need military officers who do understand these things and to some extent can explain it to the troops, but you're probably not going to spend an awful lot of time talking about these subjects, but have an understanding yourself and an officer corps that understands what it's like, for example, to be an officer in a constitutional republic like we have, and also to understand some of the economic things that we're talking about. So I think there was a time when, for example, at West Point, everybody was an engineer, and what you might call the social sciences were neglected. Today, interestingly enough, at West Point, the social science department is one of the most largest and one of the most important. So what you're doing here is exactly on the right track. And I'm not a shill for the professor, but it really is important that Army officers, military officers generally, have this perspective.
Next question. Yes, Mr. Ford.
Sir, we were fortunate enough to have President Reagan during the Cold War and to end the evil empire. But we missed out on him, as Thomas Friedman said, when the world became flat. In this this quick changing globalization that's taken over the world for the past 20 years and kind of led to the problems we're in right now where businesses are being overregulated here and they're taking their product offshore to China or anywhere else. how would Reagan have negotiated those challenges with the American spirit? I mean, obviously he would deregulate the economic sector, but how would he instill that American spirit to bring the manufacturing back to America?
Well, there's two ways to answer that. One is, I think there's no question that he would do everything he could to take away barriers to businesses, manufacturing being in the United States. Another way of looking at it, though, is that if you look at economics generally, there's some things that are going to be done in other countries where labor rates are lower. What you have to be sure, however, that they're not being artificially lowered by using slave labor or oppressive conditions and all that sort of thing. So it's a pretty complex subject, and there's no real magic way you can just say, well, we're going to do this to keep our manufacturing here. But the one thing you've got to be sure is that you're not doing things that inhibit people from keeping their businesses here or starting new businesses here. And then figure out how you do handle globalization to maximize the best way in which resources can be utilized. And then when that happens, if you're going to be displacing workers here, find out how you are going to use it. Our best use today is, for the most part, in the information field. That's where we have a best use. Things that require a lot of pretty low-level labor may well be done better. On the other hand, what we're learning is that there's no beating America quality at all levels. And that's why a lot of businesses are now advertising that used to have their operators answering phones in India are now saying that our phones are answered in the United States. I myself, when I was in business, we tried to use Mexican labor, for example, for some things, printing and some other things, because the labor rates were lower. We found that the quality was not as good. So there are ways to handle this, I think, but the main thing is to accept the fact that there are going to be some things that are going to go overseas, but at least make it at least as good where you can to keep the businesses here.
Would you like to comment?
No, I agree with that, and you know, some of this is policy sensitive, and one of your assumptions was correct, but it's a big deal, and that is the regulation question. If you're holding back the creative capacity of the United States to create wealth, why are we complaining about India creating wealth? I mean, we've got a job to do right here. And we need to, so that deregulation is important. Also, the level of taxes, but even more important than the level of taxes, it is the rate of taxes at the margin. And we're about ready to have the largest tax increase in American history by operation of existing law. And if you think the economy is weak now, you get a load of it after that takes place.
A last question, Mr. Salmaska.
Sir, it was said that Reagan believed détente to be immoral because you leave a large portion of the population captive. But on the domestic side of things, did he believe budget deficits to be immoral? Kind of, you know, kicking the can down the road, spending more than we take in. And if not, I guess my question would be, why not?
Well, he didn't believe that deficits were necessarily immoral. He felt that they were wrong and something to be avoided. And indeed, he accepted deficits for a period of time during the military buildup. He said, if I have to choose between a deficit and not having a capable military, I'll take the capable military and suffer the deficit. But he was definitely in favor of reducing deficits. And his budget path for his last 3 budgets were on a declining deficit path, which, if continued into the next administration, would ultimately have reduced the deficit, abolished the deficit. So he did not believe in deficits as a regular part of fiscal policy, but there were some situations, and I think one of the problems we have today is during the current administration we have increased the deficit as much as all the other presidents put together, and so we have a serious problem with the deficit, particularly since if you look at what happened, we had the stimulus and so increased spending by the amount of the stimulus, which was just right around $1 trillion. Incidentally, we never talked about $1 trillion at once in the entire time I was in the government. and there, of course, there's a bumper sticker that don't tell the current administration what comes after trillion. But what I was going to say is you had the stimulus. Now the stimulus was supposed to be a one-time thing, but when the stimulus year was over in the next budget, we didn't reduce the budget, the spending by the amount of that stimulus and go back to what the base was before the stimulus. Instead, we put other spending in the place of the stimulus. And so as a result, we have trillion-dollar deficits 4 years in a row, and potentially for the foreseeable future.
I'll just add that, recall that in the entire 8 years of the Reagan presidency, the House of Representatives was still in Democrat hands. Reagan thought balancing the budget was very important, but he thought two things that the Attorney General listed were more important. One was the defense buildup because of the question of human freedom abroad and the potential to attack American freedom from abroad. He also thought that taxes were a freedom issue, that you can seldom affect a person's freedom more directly than taking from him the fruit out of his mouth, the bread and fruit of his labor. And he thought that tax rates, so he thought those two things were more important. With a Democrat House, he couldn't have all three. If he had agreed to scale down the defenses of America, if he had agreed to raise taxes, he could have had a deal with the Democrats to balance the budget, but that he wouldn't do. And it's another occasion where, you know, he was able to prioritize and stand on principle, and that's a choice he made. He was in favor, however, of a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution to constrain himself and others in this kind of situation. It'd have to be correctly written. He actually got it within one vote of passing in the Senate. But it'd have to be carefully written so that it doesn't do violence to other constitutional principles. But that is always an option because our politicians don't seem to have the self-control to attack that problem in and of themselves.
Final comment, Attorney General Meese.
Well, I think that appreciate, for one thing, appreciate the very excellent questions, and also, as I say, the fact that you have this class and that you're paying attention to these kinds of things, because I think it's an important background for you to have, whatever you do next, whether it's in the military or civilian. I think that the thing that perhaps is most important to take away is that presidents like Ronald Reagan, who operate on the basis of principle, who've thought about what they're going to do, who have good philosophical and governing foundation of ideas, is extremely important. And that the basic principles of the founding are as valid today as they were in 1787. And that we have to look to those principles because the things that they were looking for, which was primarily the freedom of the people to engage in political activity and to govern their own country through their representatives, and those kinds of things are as important today. And one of the real problems we have today is not enough people have what Ken and ISI called civic literacy. People who understand our government, understand the issues, and understand how they can have a part in influencing their elected representatives to maintain the kinds of things that we've been talking about today. So that's why I think what's happening here, the fact that this film, as I understand of this series, is going to be available for a lot of purposes, but everything that can be done by Professor Factor and others like him to bring this kind of information to young people of your age, I think is an extremely valuable contribution to the country.
Attorney General Ed Meese, Chief Economic Advisor to President Ronald Reagan. Ken Cribb, thank you so much for joining us here today. Really appreciate it. We hope you'll come back again soon.
Absolutely.